The chandelier in the living room shimmered, casting fractured light across the polished marble floor, but none of it softened the tension in the air. The room was full of laughter and chatter, the kind that felt rehearsed, superficial, and forced. Javier leaned back in his chair, glass of wine in hand, his eyes scanning the crowd like a man surveying his domain. His posture was confident, almost arrogant, his smile sharp and predatory. Every movement, every gesture was meant to dominate, to assert control, to remind everyone, including his wife Luciana, that he believed he held all the power. Luciana sat quietly beside him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, fingers trembling slightly under the veneer of composure. She wore a soft, understated dress that contrasted with Javier's polished suit, simple yet elegant, as though she had dressed for the shadows he insisted she occupy. Her dark eyes flicked around the room, avoiding confrontation, while her lips pressed together, holding back the sighs and tears that threatened to escape. She had endured this before, countless times, and yet each new humiliation carved into her heart as though it were the first. Marisol, her younger sister, lingered near the corner of the room, leaning casually against the doorway with arms crossed, observing. She was younger, yes, and often underestimated, but her sharp gaze missed nothing. She had watched Javier's cruelty grow over the years, the subtle dismissals, the pointed jabs, the laughter that followed when Luciana flinched. He was arrogant, entitled, and entirely convinced of his superiority. But he had overlooked one thing. She was watching, calculating, taking note of every word, every move, every flaw. Javier's voice cut through the room, smooth, confident, and deliberately harsh. Luciana, he said, gesturing toward his wife as if she were part of the decor. Perhaps you'd like to tell everyone again how you contribute to this household? His smile was cruelly sweet, the kind that invited mockery. The laughter that followed was uncomfortable but immediate, punctuated by a few polite coughs from guests who were unsure whether to intervene. Luciana's face remained neutral, but her shoulders tightened imperceptibly. She did not answer. She had learned long ago that words only fueled his arrogance. That reaction was ammunition for him, and silence was her only shield. Marisol's eyes narrowed slightly. She could feel the sharp edge of humiliation in the room. The way the guest's discomfort failed to translate into action. Her fingers flexed against her side, the beginning of a plan already forming in her mind. Javier thrived on attention, on dominance, on the idea that everyone, especially Luciana, was beneath him. That arrogance would be his undoing. He leaned closer to Luciana, voice dropping slightly so only she could hear. You know, I don't understand why I married someone so helpless. Do you even try to keep up with me? Or is it easier to sit quietly and do nothing? Luciana forced a smile that did not reach her eyes. I try in my own way, she whispered, voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. You try? Javier said, his tone louder now, theatrical. I see nothing. I see weakness, dependence, uselessness. And yet I am supposed to be grateful. Everyone, look at this. This is my wife. Graceful, beautiful, and utterly incapable of contributing anything of value. The room stiffened. Guests exchanged uneasy glances. Some shifted in their seats, others pretended to sip wine, too polite or too afraid to interrupt. Marisol did not flinch. She remained perfectly still, absorbing every word, every nuance, every detail of his arrogance and the cracks in his ego that he never realized existed. Luciana's hands gripped the edge of her chair, knuckles white. She had endured insults, belittlement, and public humiliation, and yet she had never retaliated, not openly. But tonight, she sensed a quiet shift, a subtle alignment of power that Javier could not perceive. Her sister's presence was a reminder that she was not alone, that the tide could change if approached carefully, strategically. Javier's laughter echoed, sharp and metallic. And you, he said, pointing at Luciana with theatrical precision, smile through it all. You smile as if this is enough, but it isn't. You are nothing but a shadow in my world. Marisol's jaw tightened slightly. She stepped closer, casually, letting the movement be unnoticed by most, yet deliberate enough that her gaze met her sister's for a brief moment. It was a silent signal. Observe, endure, and prepare. Javier's arrogance would be the key to his undoing, and she had already begun calculating the steps needed to expose it. The rest of the evening continued in the same pattern. Javier monopolized conversation, his jokes at Luciana's expense growing bolder with each sip of wine. Luciana responded with quiet civility, nodding politely, holding back tears, while Marisol continued to catalog everything: Javier's weaknesses, the inconsistencies in his stories, the subtle signs of financial overconfidence, and the cracks in his social armor. At one point, Javier leaned back, surveying the room with smug satisfaction. "You see?" he said to the guests, his voice loud and triumphant. "This is what I deal with every day: graceful, polite, and utterly incapable. And yet, they call it a marriage." He chuckled, clearly enjoying the attention. Luciana's lips pressed into a thin line. She said nothing, as always, but inside, a quiet determination began to form. She had endured enough humiliation, enough public mockery. Tonight was another reminder of why she needed strength, not just for herself, but for the life she and her sister would reclaim. Marisol finally spoke, voice low and measured. So that only Luciana could hear. "It's okay, I see everything. I'll make sure this ends. He won't get away with it anymore." Luciana's eyes softened, a flicker of hope amidst the pain. She nodded once, imperceptibly, her heart lifting slightly at the thought of support, strategy, and eventual justice. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to imagine the possibility of standing unafraid, of seeing Javier humbled, without ever raising her own voice in retaliation. The evening drew to a close. Guests departed, leaving the house quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the faint ticking of a clock in the hall. Javier, still confident, made his way toward the bedroom, oblivious to the calculations quietly forming in the minds of the two sisters. Luciana moved to her room, closing the door softly behind her. She sank into the chair near the window, staring out at the city lights, taking in the cool air and letting the events of the evening settle. Marisol remained nearby, a silent sentinel, watching, listening, planning. She placed a hand gently on Luciana's shoulder, offering unspoken reassurance and determination. "You've endured enough," Marisol whispered. "Tomorrow, we start changing everything." Luciana leaned back, taking a deep, steadying breath. Her body relaxed slightly, though her mind remained alert. She knew the road ahead would require patience, cunning, and careful strategy. But for the first time in years, she felt the beginnings of power returning. Not loud, not boastful, but quiet, precise, and undeniable. In the darkness of the room, with the city lights flickering beyond the glass, the sisters shared a single, unspoken truth. Javier had underestimated them, and underestimation, as they knew well, was the first step toward his undoing. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the sheer curtains, casting a soft glow across the room where Luciana sat at the small breakfast table, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee. The events of the previous night lingered in her mind, the sting of Javier's words and laughter still fresh. She could feel the weight of his arrogance pressing on her chest, but beside her, Marisol moved with quiet determination, organizing papers, reviewing notes, and occasionally jotting something down in a small notebook. "I've been observing him for months," Marisol said without looking up, her voice calm but sharp. "Every conversation, every gesture, every meeting. He thinks he's untouchable, that his control is absolute, but it isn't. And I've found exactly where his arrogance becomes vulnerability." Luciana nodded slowly, taking a sip of her coffee. Her heart was pounding, a mixture of fear, anticipation, and the spark of hope that Marisol's presence always ignited. I don't want to make things worse," she whispered. "He'll punish me if he notices anything." Marisol's gaze finally met hers, steady and unwavering. "That's why you won't act. I will. You watch, you wait. And when the moment comes, he'll realize that every insult, every humiliation, every laugh he shared at your expense, it all works against him." The day began with Javier in his usual self-assured stride, moving through the house and the staff with the commanding ease of a man convinced of his superiority. His phone buzzed incessantly, emails and messages filling the screen, each one treated with the same cavalier confidence he carried into every room. He paused only to glance at Luciana briefly, smirking, as though daring her to respond to the subtle provocations he planted with every word and gesture. Luciana remained calm, her composure a careful mask that hid her inner turmoil. She followed Marisol's instructions to the letter, answering only when necessary, speaking in measured tones, and never revealing the faintest hint of their plan. Marisol, meanwhile, moved quietly through the background, contacting key people, checking facts, and confirming the vulnerabilities they would exploit. By midday, Marisol had identified a crucial weak point: Javier's reliance on a major investor who had begun expressing doubts about his management style. It was subtle, but enough to create tension if properly leveraged. She smiled faintly, noting the precise timing required. Javier's overconfidence and obsession with appearances made him blind to the very details that could ruin him. The lunch hour arrived, and the household staff quietly prepared a meal, while Javier lectured Luciana about trivial domestic matters, his tone laced with mockery. You know, he said casually, if this house were run properly, we wouldn't even need half of these arrangements. But it's easier to just let things be, isn't it? After all, you wouldn't know where to begin. Luciana kept her face neutral, carefully serving the plates without breaking her calm. She had learned that defiance only gave him satisfaction. Marisol, seated across from her, caught the brief flicker of hurt in her sister's eyes, but also the way her posture had stiffened, a sign she was ready to follow the plan when the moment arrived. Don't you think it's time you did something useful? Javier continued, not even noticing Marisol's quiet observation. Everyone expects results, not excuses. Even our guests, family, friends, they notice your inefficiency. Marisol set down her fork and leaned forward slightly, her voice soft, almost casual. I've been thinking, she said, catching Javier's attention for the first time, about the meetings you had last week. The investor concerns, the projects delayed. It's interesting how appearances can be so deceiving, isn't it? Javier paused, frowning slightly. What are you implying? He asked, though his curiosity was more amusement than caution. He didn't see danger in a younger sister who had always seemed harmless. Marisol continued, carefully crafting each word. Well, it seems some investors are becoming uneasy. They want reassurance. They want transparency. They don't respond well to arrogance or overconfidence, as you know. Javier waved her off with a smirk. Of course. They know I handle things. Everything is under control. Transparency isn't necessary when results speak for themselves. Marisol's lips curved slightly. Yes, of course, but sometimes results are misrepresented. People hear rumors, inconsistencies, mistakes, and those things, they tend to catch up with those who believe themselves untouchable. Javier laughed, shaking his head, dismissing the subtle threat. He was so confident, so sure of his image that he didn't realize Marisol was planting seeds of doubt, quietly, cleverly, strategically. Over the next few hours, Marisol moved methodically. She sent discreet messages to Javier's associates, highlighting inconsistencies he had overlooked. She called investors, framing questions that would naturally expose his overconfidence. She documented every word, every decision, every action he had taken, creating a network of leverage that he would not see until it was too late. Luciana observed everything with a mixture of awe and relief. Her sister was precise, deliberate, and unshakable, and for the first time, Luciana felt the weight of years of humiliation begin to lift. She realized that the real battle was not about confrontation or shouting. It was about strategy, patience, and timing. And with Marisol at her side, she felt a surge of confidence she hadn't known in years. By evening, the first stage of the plan was complete. Javier had no idea that the quiet warnings, the subtle manipulations, and the careful planting of doubts had already begun to unsettle the very foundation he believed was solid. He remained oblivious, laughing, boasting, and mocking, unaware that every step he took was being quietly recorded, analyzed, and used against him. Marisol glanced at Luciana as they tidied the dining area. He doesn't see it coming, she said, her voice steady. Not yet, but soon he will. And when he does, everything changes. Luciana nodded, finally allowing herself a small smile. The fear that had gripped her for so long was replaced with cautious optimism. The path ahead would require patience and precision, but for the first time, she knew they held the advantage. The sisters exchanged a brief, silent look. It was a shared promise. No more mockery. No more humiliation. The game had begun, and this time, they would dictate the rules. Javier, for all his arrogance and cruelty, would soon learn that underestimating them had been his greatest mistake. Night fell, wrapping the mansion in a quiet stillness. Javier retired to his study, unaware of the growing storm. Luciana and Marisol moved quietly through the house, discussing plans in whispers, preparing for the next step. The first seeds of retribution had been sown, and the foundation for Javier's eventual reckoning was already being laid. The air was tense, electric, filled with anticipation. For Luciana, it was a beginning of hope. For Marisol, it was the moment to finally prove that intelligence, patience, and courage could dismantle arrogance. And for Javier, The night passed in blissful ignorance, uh, unaware that his world was quietly, irrevocably shifting. The morning sunlight spilled across the mansion, warm and unassuming, but it carried a tension that only Luciana and Marisol felt. Javier strode through the hallways with his usual air of command, unaware that the walls he had built around his ego were already cracking. The first signs of disruption had begun, subtle and quiet, but undeniable. Emails unanswered, questions redirected, whispered doubts in the ears of his associates, all orchestrated by Marisol, patient, meticulous, and unobserved. Luciana sat in the study, her hands folded neatly on her lap, watching as her husband sprawled behind his desk, tapping impatiently at his phone. He was a man so convinced of his invincibility that he failed to notice the quiet storm brewing. Marisol leaned against the doorway, holding a folder that contained the proof of his missteps, financial oversights, and social blunders. A catalog of arrogance waiting to be revealed. "You're calm," Javier said without looking up, his voice casual but edged with condescension. "I would think after last night you'd be on edge. You should try harder. Being timid only makes your mistakes more obvious." Luciana's lips pressed together, a slight smile tugging at the corners invisible to him. "I'm observing," she replied softly. "Patience is often more powerful than immediate reaction." Javier's frown deepened, though he waved her off with a dismissive gesture. "Observation? You'll learn soon enough that watching doesn't prevent failure." Marisol stepped forward, letting her presence fill the room just enough to draw his attention. "Perhaps," she said, her voice calm and deliberate. "But observation allows one to see what others overlook. Even small inconsistencies become significant when you know where to look." He chuckled, a low, arrogant sound. "Small inconsistencies? That sounds like a lot of overthinking. You're sisters, aren't you? Always complicating simple matters." Marisol's eyes met Luciana's briefly, a silent signal. Today was the day the first pieces of their plan would take effect. She opened the folder slowly, letting it catch the sunlight, the papers crisp and precise. "I suppose that depends on how you define simple," she said. "Some things can appear flawless until someone examines them carefully." Javier leaned forward, curiosity piqued but still masked by arrogance. "What are you talking about?" Marisol smiled faintly. "You know the investor meeting you rushed last week? The one where everything seemed under control? I've spoken with a few people. They notice discrepancies, they're concerned. They want clarity." Javier laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "Discrepancies? That's nonsense. They trust me. Everything is in order. These are people who know the value of results, not petty concerns." "Perhaps," Marisol replied, voice steady. "But trust erodes when arrogance overshadows transparency. You see, even the best results can be questioned if people sense concealment." Luciana's pulse quickened. Marisol's words were careful, precise, and loaded with the first real pressure Javier had felt in months. He shifted uneasily in his chair, his ego brushing against the first hints of doubt. He didn't see it clearly yet, but the seeds had been planted. The day progressed with a tense undercurrent. Marisol contacted a few key associates under the guise of casual conversation, subtly confirming details of Javier's mismanagement. Each call, each message, carefully structured, built an invisible network of pressure that Javier could not perceive. Luciana watched him, noting the faint signs of unease she had never seen before. The slight twitch of a finger, the way his smile faltered just a fraction when a call interrupted him. By mid-afternoon, Marisol had scheduled an informal family lunch, ostensibly casual, but carefully designed to highlight Javier's arrogance and oversights in a social setting. She arranged the seating so that influential relatives and family friends would be present, the perfect audience for a controlled confrontation. As they gathered for lunch, Javier carried his usual confidence, oblivious to the careful orchestration around him. He joked loudly, mocking Luciana with subtle digs, each one meant to display his control and dominance. Guests laughed politely, some with genuine discomfort, sensing tension they didn't fully understand. Marisol served as the quiet conductor of the room, guiding conversations, nudging topics toward Javier's weaknesses without raising suspicion. She mentioned investments casually, commented on recent business trends, and observed reactions. Each carefully chosen word planted questions and doubts in the minds of those around him. "Javier," she said softly, almost conversationally, "I heard some investors were curious about the project deadlines last week. They wanted reassurance about leadership continuity. Funny how perception can be as important as performance, isn't it?" Javier laughed, trying to dismiss the comment, but there was an edge in his voice now. Perception? They'll see results. That's all that matters. Trust me, everything is under control. Marisol's gaze was unwavering. Control is sometimes an illusion, especially when it is taken for granted. Some people notice when things aren't as perfect as they appear. At that moment, one of Javier's associates, previously aligned with him, shifted in his seat. The subtle doubt had been seated. He asked a question about a recent financial report, noting minor inconsistencies. Javier attempted to answer confidently, but his tone faltered slightly, the cracks beginning to show. Luciana watched silently, a mix of relief and pride rising within her. Marisol's strategy was working. She had created a controlled environment in which Javier's arrogance and mismanagement could not hide. He remained unaware that every gesture, every slip, and every defensive response was quietly observed and catalogued. By late afternoon, the tension in the room was palpable, though Javier still smiled, trying to maintain the illusion of command. Marisol had successfully created a subtle network of pressure. Investors, associates, and family members were now quietly questioning his competence, and he remained oblivious. As the lunch concluded, Javier returned to his office, still smirking, unaware that the first real challenge to his arrogance had taken root. Marisol and Luciana exchanged a brief glance, a silent acknowledgement of progress. The first stage of the plan was complete. Javier's ego, long unchallenged, had been pierced. The rest of the day passed in a careful balance of observation and preparation. Marisol continued contacting key allies, confirming details and reinforcing subtle doubts, while Luciana regained a sense of empowerment. For the first time in years, she felt the beginnings of control returning, the knowledge that her sister had orchestrated the start of a reckoning that would not be ignored. By evening, Javier's confidence remained intact on the surface, but beneath it, the first tremors of doubt had begun. The quiet pressure, invisible to him, would grow in the coming days, amplified by Marisol's precision and patience. He had no idea that his arrogance, his cruelty, and his overconfidence had all become tools for his eventual downfall. As night fell, the sisters retreated to their shared space, reviewing the day and planning next steps. Every move had been carefully calculated, every reaction noted. They knew that Javier's next mistake would be inevitable, and when it came, it would be undeniable, public, and irreversible. Marisol rested her hand briefly on Luciana's shoulder. He won't know what hit him, she whispered. Patience and precision. That's all we need. He's arrogant enough to walk right into it. Luciana nodded, finally allowing herself a deep breath of relief. The fear that had dominated her life for so long was being replaced by determination, strategy, and hope. Together, they had begun the process of reclaiming dignity, power, and respect, quietly, deliberately, and unassailably. And Javier, blissfully unaware, continued to plan and boast, setting the stage for the inevitable reckoning that would leave him humbled, shamed, and forced to confront the consequences of his cruelty. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the mansion, but it could not soften the tension that hung in the air. Today was not like any other day. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, quiet strategy, and a subtle undercurrent of triumph that only Luciana and Marisol could sense. Javier moved through the house with his usual arrogance, unaware that the carefully woven network of pressure, doubt, and strategic exposure was now converging on him. Luciana sat at the breakfast table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, feeling a mixture of nervousness and exhilaration. The plan had been months in the making, orchestrated with precision, patience, and a level of cunning that Javier would never see coming. Beside her, Marisol reviewed the final details of the day's orchestration. Every phone call, every subtle nudge, every well-placed hint to investors and associates had led to this moment. You ready? Marisol asked quietly, her eyes sharp, scanning the empty hallway for any sign of interruption. Luciana nodded, her lips pressing together in a small, confident smile. I've never been more ready. Javier entered the dining room, his presence commanding, his steps confident. He carried the usual air of superiority, completely unaware that today his arrogance would be his downfall. What are we doing today? He asked, trying to sound casual, though there was a slight edge of curiosity in his voice. He didn't notice the calm precision in the sister's demeanor. Marisol gestured toward the dining table, where documents and carefully prepared notes lay in neat stacks. We're reviewing the investor feedback from last week, she said. Her tone was calm, deliberate, almost conversational, but the weight behind her words was undeniable. They've raised some concerns. It's important to address them carefully. Javier chuckled dismissively. Concerns? Nothing they say could possibly affect me. I've handled much bigger challenges than this. Marisol allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile. Of course, she said. But sometimes, the bigger the challenge, the more important it is to see things clearly, especially when there are discrepancies in the reports, inconsistencies that might go unnoticed by some, but are very obvious to others. Luciana's pulse quickened. The first reaction of doubt flashed across Javier's face, brief but undeniable. Marisol's words were carefully chosen to expose him without alerting him immediately, to make him falter while maintaining his facade. By mid-morning, the first cracks began to show. Marisol had orchestrated a series of communications from investors and associates, highlighting inconsistencies and omissions in Javier's recent dealings. He attempted to respond confidently, but the questions grew sharper and his usual arrogance began to slip. Luciana watched silently, noting every flicker of unease, every twitch of irritation that betrayed his otherwise controlled demeanor. Javier, Marisol said softly, leaning forward slightly. I spoke with Mr. Alvarez this morning. He mentioned some delayed reports and missed deadlines. He's concerned about leadership accountability. Would you like to clarify? Javier's face tightened. He laughed. A short, nervous sound that didn't reach his eyes. Everything is under control. I've already explained this. Marisol shook her head slightly. Perhaps, but some people feel differently. They notice details. And when details contradict the appearance of perfection, it can be problematic. The words were measured, almost casual, but the effect was profound. Javier shifted in his seat, his confidence wavered, and for the first time in months, he sensed that something was slipping from his grasp. The sisters continued, quietly but deliberately dismantling his armor. Marisol had prepared a small presentation, under the guise of reviewing minor details for clarity, but it highlighted every misstep, every overlooked obligation, and every moment of arrogance that had undermined his credibility. Each slide, each chart, each carefully chosen word was designed to reveal the truth while maintaining the appearance of casual discussion. Luciana observed, silent but engaged. She saw the flickers of panic, the forced composure, the subtle defensiveness in Javier's posture. She felt a sense of vindication, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that years of humiliation, of being belittled and ignored, were finally coming to an end. By late afternoon, the culmination of Marisol's plan was underway. A video call had been arranged with key investors, carefully timed to ensure maximum impact. Javier entered the room, confident as ever, unaware that the network of doubts, questions, and carefully orchestrated evidence was about to converge on him. Good afternoon, everyone, he said, attempting charm and control simultaneously. Everything is perfectly under control. I've handled the reports personally. Marisol allowed a faint smile. Of course, she said, but there are some points that require clarification. For instance, the inconsistencies in the financial projections, the delayed timelines for delivery, and the feedback from our key partners. I've compiled everything here to make it easier to address. Javier's confident smile faltered slightly. He attempted to respond, but the investor's questions, amplified by Marisol's careful framing, forced him to stumble, to justify, to explain, all while maintaining composure. Every misstep was catalogued, every falter observed. Luciana sat quietly, feeling a mixture of awe and satisfaction. The man who had bullied her for so long, who had belittled her and tried to assert dominance in every possible way, was finally facing the consequences of his arrogance. She felt no joy in his humiliation, only relief and the satisfaction of justice being served. By evening, the final phase was complete. Javier was humiliated, not through shouting or confrontation, but through the quiet, precise execution of a plan that leveraged his own flaws against him. His confidence was shattered, his credibility questioned, and his arrogance exposed. Marisol and Luciana shared a quiet moment in the now empty dining room. It's done, Marisol whispered. He knows he underestimated us. Luciana nodded, relief flooding her. We've reclaimed our dignity, she said softly, not through force, but through patience, strategy, and courage. Javier, sitting alone in his office, stared at the remaining documents, emails, and messages that had systematically dismantled the facade he had maintained for so long. He realized belatedly that his arrogance, his cruelty, and his obsession with appearances had made him blind to the very forces that could and did bring him down. The night descended on the mansion, quiet, but filled with a sense of triumph for the sisters. Luciana felt a weight lift from her shoulders, the years of belittlement and humiliation replaced by a newfound confidence. Marisol felt a sense of satisfaction, not only for the successful execution of their plan, but for the knowledge that justice, clever and deliberate, had been delivered. For Javier, the lesson was harsh and unforgettable. Arrogance unchecked leads to downfall. Cruelty invites retribution, and underestimating those you believe powerless is a mistake that can never be undone. As the sisters sat together in the soft glow of the evening, they shared a silent acknowledgement of victory. It was not loud, not boastful, but it was complete. Luciana had been empowered. Marisol had demonstrated intelligence and courage, and Javier had finally faced the consequences of his actions. The mansion, once filled with tension and the weight of cruelty, now echoed with quiet relief. The beginning of a new chapter where dignity, respect, and patience reigned supreme. The lesson had been taught, and it would not be forgotten.